And basically, it represents trauma in many instances. They're up to 9 times more likely to use drugs. Hi, this is Jim Brion. Welcome to this YouTube channel where we discuss all things mental health. I encourage you to like and subscribe if you find these videos helpful, and sign up for notifications so we can let you know when more videos are coming out. What I'm going to be talking about today is some of the research into childhood trauma that draws a clear distinction between childhood trauma and mental health issues and even physical health issues in adulthood. What I'm talking about is the ACEs study, or the ACE study, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. What this is a study that was done in the 1990s with the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, which is a health maintenance organization. They interviewed like 17,000 people for this study, which was pretty extensive, and asked them to fill out questionnaires about adverse experiences they had in childhood. And what they determined was that there was a direct correlation between the number of those different adverse childhood experiences and mental health problems in adulthood, and even physical health problems in adulthood. Childhood trauma that we kind of break down and put into different categories of these adverse childhood experiences have a tremendous impact on quality of life and can be a very strong predictor of a lot of problems in adulthood. When the study was done, questions that they asked people were about things that happened in their childhood, like emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, household challenges like domestic violence in the home, substance abuse in the home, or mental illness in the home, a parent that has depression, anxiety, some kind of personality disorder. They asked them about separation and divorce, about a family member being incarcerated, and what they found was that something like 64% of the people that responded had at least one of these adverse experiences in childhood, and more than 1 in 5 reported having 3 or more. And what's been determined is once a person has 4 or more of these adverse experiences in childhood, you start to see very clear distinctions and connections between those things and negative experiences in adulthood. So the higher the number of ACEs, the higher the level of risk of serious mental health problems and even physical health problems. And what they've determined was some populations are actually more vulnerable based on their socioeconomic status, the conditions that they live in, where they learn, where they work, and where they play. So some of the ways that these early adversities have lasting impacts are things like opportunities. Opportunities for education, for developing income, for developing a self-supporting occupation. Experiencing these adverse experiences often leads to risky behaviors, drug and alcohol use, unsafe sex, even chronic disease like cancer, diabetes, HIV, and STDs. Adverse childhood experiences are directly linked to maternal health as far as unintended pregnancies, complications, and even fetal death. And clearly there are connections between adverse experiences in childhood and mental health, depression, anxiety, suicide, PTSD. And they even found correlations between adverse childhood experiences and things like injuries, traumatic brain injuries, fractures, and burns. And ultimately, when these ACEs pile up, so to speak, what it leads to is what we think of as toxic stress. And there's been extensive research into what toxic stress is and how it affects a person. And what it does is that there's excessive activation of the stress response that happens in a child's developing brain and nervous system, and it affects the way the immune system develops. It affects the way the metabolic regulatory systems develop, and it affects the way that the cardiovascular system develops. So Experiencing these ACEs can trigger all of these interacting stress response systems. So this idea of toxic stress really kind of explains how all of these different adverse experiences it gets under the skin, so to speak. And basically it represents trauma in many instances and the need for informed care, trauma-informed care. This is why when I have a new client that we're doing an intake, I'll ask them about these childhood experiences, and you can see very clear connections between the numbers of adverse experiences they had and their own mental health and even physical health. So why is it important to know about this? When people have had these adverse experiences in childhood, it often leads to developing relationship problems. There can be attachment failures, can lead people to have problems in their employment because their nervous systems aren't regulated. They have all kinds of trauma responses that they're not even aware of that impact their ability to function in daily life. This can lead to repeated cycles of abuse, and unfortunately, a lot of these things are passed on from one generation to the next. Patterns of mental health problems and even physical health problems. Often this means growing up with emotionally immature parents or parents with high conflict personality styles such as narcissistic parents or abusive parents. And what happens is the child's body and brain develops in a chronic fight, flight, freeze response. So you can see how this can lead to dysfunctional relationships and dysfunctional coping skills, and really it sets a person up to be vulnerable to abuse in adulthood. Part of what the ACE study did was create what they call an ACEs pyramid that looks at the risk factors for disease and how these events impact a person's well-being in life. And at the bottom of the pyramid, so to speak, are historical traumas and generational embodiment, meaning those transgenerational issues that go from one generation to the next. And then on top of that are social conditions. On top of that are the actual adverse experiences that happen. And then there's a disruption in neurodevelopment. Then there's a disruption in the social, emotional, and cognitive development. And then that increases the risk level. Then there's higher levels of disease, and ultimately, for many people, unfortunately, it leads to early death. Some of the health conditions that they've tracked in children as a result of these adverse experiences are kind of stunning. When people have had multiple adverse experiences in childhood, they're up to 9 times more likely to use drugs. They're up to 6 times more likely to start drinking alcohol before they're 14 years old. They're 4 times more likely to experience teenage pregnancy. And they have unexplained bodily symptoms like nausea, vomiting, dizziness, headaches at a rate of 9 times higher than the general population. And strikingly, up to 33 times the risk of having learning disabilities or behavioral problems. Having an understanding of how these adverse childhood experiences impact a person's development and learning is reflected in the fact that a person with a high level of adverse experiences in childhood is 5 times more likely to develop ADHD, 4 times more likely to develop depression, and twice as likely to attempt suicide. Now, when you look at the impacts of those adverse experiences on adults, when they grow to be an adult, we find that a person with a high level of adverse childhood experiences is 5 times more likely to have memory problems, 7 times more likely to abuse alcohol, 7.5 times more likely to be the victim of violence, sexual assault or domestic violence, and over 8 times more likely to be the perpetrator of violence. A person with a high level of adverse experiences in childhood is more than 10 times more likely to use IV drugs, almost 38 times more likely to attempt suicide in adulthood, and 10 times more likely than the average person to have suicidal thoughts. So I think looking at what these studies teach us is that we have to pay attention to this data so that we can develop better screening, so that we can understand what's happening with people before it becomes a problem. And we can develop better interventions so we can help people overcome the effects of some of this childhood trauma. Understanding these impacts and developing ways of coping with it can help us to reduce and hopefully even prevent some very serious and very costly problems that affect society, quality of life, community, and mental health and physical health. So I'm curious to hear from people also, how understanding some of this information impacts you. What kind of adverse experiences did you have in childhood? And can you see how some of those things have led to problems in adulthood? Feel free to leave comments and ask questions. And until the next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Bye-bye.